This is the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer sitting in tonight for Dan Rather. Good evening. President Bush admitted today he is frustrated that he has not been able to force the ouster of Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega. But even as the president was weighing new sanctions against Panama, Noriega was tightening his grip on power. He appointed a new puppet government in which he will pull the strings. Our coverage begins with Pentagon correspondent David Martin.
White House officials say President Bush is considering a further tightening of economic sanctions against Panama in an effort to step up the pressure against what the U.S. considers an illegal regime.
And we will consider what additionally we might do. There's a high frustration level. I'm ready to concede that. But that we are not going to give up on this.
White House officials say there seems to be international support for tougher action against Noriega. These officials say 7 Latin American countries are recalling their ambassadors from Panama.
At a meeting of the Organization of American States, the Deputy Secretary of State responded to a Panamanian challenge to present evidence of Noriega's alleged drug trafficking by summarizing the indictments handed down last year by federal grand juries in Florida. Then he ridiculed the estimated $200 to $300 million personal fortune Noriega has allegedly amassed.
3 large pleasure yachts, the Macho 1, the Macho 2, and the Macho 3. That's a lot of macho.
The Panamanian delegate didn't think it was funny.
The delegate of the United States has again subjected us to the customary repetition of fabrications, lies, and half-truths.
Pointedly, Eagleberger argued that the principle of non-intervention in the affairs of other nations does not apply to Noriega.
But non-intervention was never meant to protect individual criminals. It was never meant to promote intervention by drug traffickers in our societies against our families and children.
The U.S. now refers to Panama as an outlaw government.
Well, certainly not recognized a Noriega stooge or anything else.
Even though it has beefed up the U.S. military presence in Panama, the Bush administration has so far been unwilling to use force against Noriega. Last spring, sources say, CIA plans to support a coup were scrubbed because of congressional concerns Noriega would be assassinated in the process. But in Washington today, as the outgoing ambassador for the only Panamanian government the U.S. recognizes closed down his embassy, he hinted at what may become a new pretext for American action.
We don't have pictures, but we do have information that they are cartel members under the protection of Noriega in Panama.
Officials say that if Panama becomes a safe haven for fugitive drug lords, the administration would reconsider the use of force as a means of apprehending the fugitives, including Noriega. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
This is a scene the U.S. government hoped it would never see. General Manuel Antonio Noriega announcing the formation of yet another Panamanian government, answerable, of course, to him. Noriega calls it a free and sovereign government to be led by longtime friend and functionary of the regime, Francisco Rodriguez. But the opposition calls him a Noriega stooge.
He is number 7 in a long list of meaningless presidents, all of them at the service of General Noriega.
We need Noriega to go out of the government, and we need urgently a deep clean-out of all the Panamanian defense forces.
But except for a small student demonstration yesterday, there is little sign that the people of Panama are ready to rebel against Noriega. Just in case, Noriega's so-called dignity battalions are flexing their muscles. They are the same government-sponsored street gangs that beat opposition candidates last May. Noriega annulled the results of that election.
General Noriega himself still has the key position. He's the head of the armed forces. And as long as he holds that post, nothing fundamental has changed.
Noriega's handpicked president emphasized today that his new government is provisional. Elections were promised, but not until the United States releases frozen Panamanian funds and ceases aggression. That is unlikely. The improbable sight of U.S. tanks rumbling across Panamanian roads has become familiar as the U.S. seeks to assert what officials here call American rights under the Panama Canal Treaty. Some, such as this mock rescue of hostages at the U.S. Embassy, have led to protests by Noriega and to tense confrontations with Panamanian troops. But U.S. Embassy officials say there is no plan to halt the exercises. Noriega, for his part, appears to have no plan to halt his exercise of power. The newest billboards in Panama City proclaim him leader until the year 2000. Juan Vasquez, CBS News, Panama City.
The Pentagon reported today that it will begin sending U.S. military equipment and advisors to Colombia this weekend. It's part of a $65 million program, including men and equipment, that President Bush has promised for the war against the Medellin drug cartel. In that war, the drug barons launched a major attack today, and Mark Phillips has our report.
The answer to the Colombian government's nighttime curfew in the cartel stronghold of Medellin. A massive bomb blast in broad daylight in one of the city's industrial neighborhoods. It seriously injured 8 people. Dynamite carried in a bicycle juice cart, the local police said. Other reports said it was a rocket attack from the hills surrounding the city. The blast destroyed part of a paint factory. The shockwave bounced across the street, destroying about 50 cars at auto dealerships. High-priced foreign cars, the kind the drug lords like. It was a strange target for the Medellin cartels because car dealerships are a favorite investment of the cocaine traffickers. It's led to further speculation that the current warlike atmosphere has created an open season for attacks and vendettas of all kinds. It could have been worse, he says. With the flammable materials in the factory, there could have been a tragedy. The 10 p.m. curfew in Medellin had people scurrying for home last night, but many didn't make it. Police detained more than 500, holding them overnight and releasing most of them at daybreak. With tensions on the rise, many of the remaining Americans here began taking the State Department's advice to leave Colombia.
Things are happening around here. It makes you feel nervous, definitely.
Spouses of embassy personnel also began leaving. Because of the violence of the cartel hit squads, the so-called extraditables, the State Department hasn't allowed diplomats to bring their children here for some time.
I think that the situation has become such that it's best that we leave, though.
The daylight bombing in Medellin seems not to have been an isolated event, but part of a new cartel strategy. A caller to a radio station today claimed responsibility on behalf of the cartel. The nighttime bombs claim few victims, the caller said. There will be more victims now, he said, because we will begin placing our bombs in the daytime. U.S. aid to help the Colombian government fight back against the cartels is now not expected to begin arriving until Sunday at the earliest. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Bogota.
And still ahead on the CBS Evening News, Bruce Hall on today's bizarre twist in the trial of televangelist Jim Bakker, and David Browning recalls the nightmare that began on Labor Day weekend 50 years ago.
Men crossing the border in overwhelming numbers. More than 70 divisions led by motorized troops.
The extraordinary saga of television evangelist Jim Bakker today took perhaps its most unusual turn yet. The judge suspended the PTL founder's fraud trial after Bakker claimed he was seeing things. Bruce Hall reports.
A sobbing, disheveled Jim Bakker muttering, "Please don't do this to me," was ordered to undergo psychiatric testing today after his attorney said he was suffering hallucinations and severe depression. The startling development came after Bakker's attorneys told federal judge Robert Potter the PTL founder was no longer rational and needed immediate medical help. Psychiatrist Basil Jackson, who has been treating Bakker for 9 months, testified he found Bakker this morning lying in a fetal position with his head stuck under a couch. The judge refused a defense motion that Bakker be admitted to a private hospital and ordered him sent to a federal psychiatric facility for evaluation.
As I said when I testified, to put it in lay language, the man is stressed out.
Friends say Bakker's troubles surfaced yesterday after a prosecution witness collapsed on the stand. They say Bakker had to be led out of the courthouse because he believed the people outside had taken the forms of frightening animals out to destroy him.
He was just afraid to come out because of what he might face out here. He didn't know. He was just scared for his life.
He was doing a little better last night when I left him, but he had hallucinated yesterday quite a bit.
But many of the spectators who have followed the bizarre 4-day trial questioned the mental breakdown.
I don't care what they say. There's nothing wrong with him. In my opinion, he's sane.
It's all a sham.
Tammy Bakker says her husband's ordeal has left him a broken man.
We have been under emotional stress for 2.5 years, and we've been holding steady for 2.5 years, and I think that he just couldn't hold steady anymore.
The other possibility is that Jim Bakker faked and staged this mental breakdown, just as he's faked and acted in so many other instances.
Late today, Bakker arrived at a federal psychiatric institute in Butner, North Carolina. He will undergo evaluation to determine if he is competent and whether his fraud and conspiracy trial can resume. Bruce Hall, CBS News, Charlotte.
The accused killer of a young black man who was shot in Brooklyn last week surrendered to police today in upstate New York. 18-year-old Joseph Fema reportedly hitchhiked to the area, although he did not know anyone there. His arrest came just one day after funeral services for 16-year-old Yusef Hawkins. Hawkins and 3 friends were accosted by a white mob in the mistaken belief that they were friends of a young white woman. The government today moved against an industrial chemical linked to cancer. The announcement calls for controls on one of the most common toxic air pollutants, but does not deal with the chief cause of the problem. Ron Allen reports.
Today's new Environmental Protection Agency regulations are the first comprehensive attempt by the federal government to reduce benzene levels in the air. Benzene is a chemical, a cancer-causing air pollutant that's emitted by gas fumes, automobile exhausts, and industrial smokestacks. Industries such as iron, steel, and chemicals. A federal court ordered the new laws after environmentalists filed suit 4 years ago.
When these regulations are in place, 90% of all benzene emissions will be eliminated from stationary sources.
The EPA says the cancer risk from exposure will be lowered to 1 chance in 1 million for most Americans, and 1 chance in 10,000 for people who live near industrial plants that release benzene. All affected industries will be required to install new anti-pollution equipment, new equipment that will cost billions of dollars over the next several years. Industry spokesmen say that's an unnecessary financial burden.
They would amount to about $1 billion impact, and it's not clear that additional public health would be protected.
We think the standards that we've posed are feasible, are economically feasible and achievable.
But not addressed today, benzene emissions from automobile exhausts, which virtually all Americans are exposed to.
They've stopped short of protecting public health to a level that that people expect and deserve.
Regulations on automobile exhausts are contained in President Bush's clean air proposal that must still be debated by Congress. But environmentalists see today's announcement as the first concrete government response since benzene was identified as a hazardous pollutant 12 years ago. Ron Allen, CBS News, Washington.
Buckingham Palace formally confirmed today that Princess Anne and her commoner husband Mark Phillips are separating. Anne, Queen Elizabeth's only daughter and 7th in line to the throne, married Phillips nearly 16 years ago, a storybook affair televised to 500 million people around the world. But the couple spent much of their time apart. Today, the princess was in Puerto Rico when the announcement came.
It's Color Tile's Labor Day savings celebration. Hurry now for store-wide savings of up to 51%. Save up to 51% on every ceramic tile, up to 30% on no-wax vinyl tile. Save up to 25% on every Armstrong sheet vinyl, and every in-stock wall covering is half price. Plus, a spectacular introductory offer on new color carpet. Save up to 39% on every square yard of DuPont Stainmaster carpet. Only at the Labor Day savings celebration. Only at Color Tile. Hurry, sale ends Monday.
Now Red Lobster tempts you like never before with king crab legs, sweet snow crab, luscious Dungeness. It's our Crab Lovers Festival, starting at an incredible $6.95. Give in to temptation. 8 great crab and seafood platters you love, starting at just $6.95. The Crab Lovers Festival, now at Red Lobster. And kids get shrimp, a complete meal, just $1.95.
This is one of 570 million refund locations for American Express traveler's checks. Now you can get a refund virtually anywhere there's a phone. Only from American Express traveler's checks.
Moscow, which has been dodging ethnic unrest in the culturally diverse Soviet Union, took a different kind of hit today. And Alan Pizzi reports.
The Soviet Evening News ignored a defiant gesture against the Kremlin. By an overwhelming majority, Moldavian leaders today gave their native tongue precedence over Russian by declaring Moldavian the official language of their tiny republic. Language has galvanized dissent among the Soviet Union's diverse ethnic groups, many of whom feel Russian was imposed on them at the expense of their own cultural backgrounds. In Moldavia, Stalin forced the use of the Russian Cyrillic alphabet after he annexed the territory from neighboring Romania in 1940. Today's legislation restores the Latin alphabet. During 3 days of debate, the Moldavian Communist Party chief, at the urging of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, tried to water the legislation down. The final compromise kept Russian as what was termed the language of interethnic relations. But it wasn't likely to placate the bill's opponents. This week, strikes by Russian speakers opposed to the legislation brought transport and other industries to a standstill. In areas with heavy Russian populations, entire towns closed down. At one point, more than 100,000 Russians were on strike in Moldavia. Strike leaders claim to have Kremlin backing. Soviet TV coverage of the issue has been weighted in favor of those opposed to the language law. The Moscow press had unleashed a barrage of criticism of Moldavian and other nationalists.
I think the Russians who have been the dominant national group in the Soviet Union will simply have to learn to live with the fact that they aren't quite so dominant as they used to be.
In effect, the Moldavians rewrote their own history today, and the fact that even the intervention of Gorbachev couldn't prevent them doing it must be sending a few shivers through the Kremlin. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Moscow.
A new chapter today in the month of protest against South Africa's racially segregated elections, which will be held next week. In Johannesburg, university students repeatedly defied a government ban on demonstrating. Police fired volleys of tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the students, who then reassembled for another go-round. Robert Schakne died this morning in Washington from cancer. He was 63, one of the old guard here at CBS. He came up through the ranks, worked here for 33 years, was a fine person, respected and loved by his colleagues, and one of the best correspondents we ever had. Bob Schakne literally covered the world for CBS News.
You could still hear shooting in the streets from time to time during the night.
As Latin American bureau chief in the mid-1960s, he reported on wars and revolutions from all over the continent, from the bottom of a Bolivian tin mine, he liked to say, to the top of the Andes. In Vietnam, as in Korea, he was always where the war was the worst, because that was where the stories were.
That was incoming artillery, or incoming mortars. People here seem to know the difference, but a visitor can't really tell.
He was proudest of his coverage of the civil rights struggle, which sometimes involved risking his life and other times required staring down public officials.
Let them see you. I want to talk to you. Are you for integration?
Well, Governor, I'm here as a reporter to find out your views, which are pertinent. You as the governor of a sovereign state.
In later years, he uncovered incompetence and deceit during the New York City fiscal crisis, helped us understand 3 Mile Island, Attica, and the Challenger disaster. Schakne was old-fashioned in all the right ways. He had a passion for accuracy, and he never waited for the news to come to him. He went looking for it.
But an internal NASA document obtained by CBS News discloses that the numbers used to sell the shuttle program to Congress at a supposed bargain price were rigged.
He was not a stylist. What set his work apart was the detail, insight, and original reporting he brought to every assignment. His career defined what we now call the investigative reporter.
Robert Schakne, CBS News, Washington.
And he was a reporter until the very last. It was Bob Schakne himself who called the Washington Bureau yesterday to report to his friends that the end was probably near. Tomorrow marks the 50th anniversary of the beginning of World War II, and perhaps that is still the hardest part to believe, that it was not hundreds of years ago in some less civilized time, but only 50 years ago, when some of us were already on this earth, that 6 million people were exterminated because of their religion, that 50 million people eventually died, and that the world hovered at the edge of a new dark age. We have part one of a remembrance tonight from David Browning.
History, James Joyce wrote, is a nightmare from which we are trying to awaken. Half a century ago, mankind's most unspeakable nightmare began, as the summer of 1939 in Europe turned to autumn and to darkness. America that Labor Day weekend was looking forward to a last bit of summer fun. Big crowds were gathering at the New York World's Fair. The Wizard of Oz had just opened in movie theaters. At the top of the bestseller list, The Grapes of Wrath.
Among returning notables are Mrs. Joseph P. Kennedy, wife of America's envoy to Britain, and 3 of her 9 children, Bobby, Eunice, and Kathleen.
The big passenger liners were bringing more and more Americans home from Europe. Many were convinced the United States would never be dragged into another European war. Maybe there would be no war at all.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London.
But 50 years ago tonight, the radio warned otherwise.
The general opinion in London is that if Poland fights, Britain fights.
And then dawn, the first day of September 1939.
A bulletin from London. The official Warsaw radio announced German troops had launched a full-scale attack against towns in the Polish corridor.
To the people who lived it at Nazi gunpoint, it is as vivid as though it were yesterday.
The 1st of September, for the first time, I have seen people are being killed by bullets from planes.
High over the Polish countryside they fly, ready to strike at the first likely target.
They were just killing everybody who were moving on the road. They were even killing the animals. You can even see the pilot sitting in the plane, and he went after me. Look, I saw him after me, and finally I dropped down in the potatoes field, and he dropped bomb, but the bomb went next to me.
These are actual battle scenes of the Nazi advance on Warsaw.
As Jews, we were terribly, terribly afraid. And I remember several times in a row I dreamt that it is a dream, that all I have to do is open my eyes now and see that the swastika is gone.
Warsaw aflame. This is the funeral pyre of Poland's freedom.
It's so hard to describe it, because how can you describe fear? I can still see them with those boots and those murder eyes.
Seemingly endless are the lines of Polish prisoners marching to concentration camps. On their faces is written Poland's tragic plight.
I still have their loud crying in my ears, because they had the premonition that one era ended and another terrible began.
For the survivors, there is still the terrible sense of loss that began that September day. Rose Footer survived the death camps, but lost her youth.
What hurt me most is that I didn't have any teen years, because in the teen years I was on the bars.
Michael Preisler survived Auschwitz, but has felt pain for 50 years.
The September 1, 39 actually spoiled my normal life.
And in the gathering Holocaust, Anna Fisher lost all her family, mother, father, 7 brothers and sisters.
Many people had this feeling that no matter what, someone has to survive in order to tell the story.
And I'm Bob Schieffer, sitting in tonight for Dan Rather. Good night.
You're about to look inside the high-rise horror of public housing, the nightmare America paid for and forgot. What will the next 48 hours be like tonight? This is CBS.